Today we are going to be talking about someone who has a little bit of an anger issue, and also someone who could remind you of a certain character from a rhythm game. Beside all of that, we'll cover everything about her kit as usual and understand it as simply as possible, along with some more extra stuff too. Before starting with anything about her kit, let's look at some basic stuff about Chasca herself. So she's a 5-star Anemobo user, and these are her stats at level 90. She gains a crit rate from her ascension, and her birth year is October 12th. Starting with her normal attacks, she just shoots 4 times with her bow, which isn't something really useful. And here's the multiplier too. Going to her charged attacks, it's pretty basic once again. Aiming will deal more damage, and fully charging the shot deals anemo damage after it hits the enemy. Also, here's the multiplier. Going to her skill, and let me tell you that it's one of a kind. So after using her skill, she mounts her gun and can travel around riding her gun, and here's what it looks like. Now as for the phlogiston cost, it's pretty similar to how Wanderer works. So the phlogiston cost is normal while moving, but while sprinting or climbing, the phlogiston consumption rate is increased. Along with all of this, her interruption resistance will also be increased significantly. Also, before moving on further, let's know the basics of how the gun works.
Pin, causing it to travel forward.
I mean how it works in game. So her gun has a total of 6 bullets, and she fires these bullets towards the enemy to deal damage. Now you have 2 different options as to how you want to fire. There's a tap variant and a hold variant. So after using her skill while you're riding her gun, if you tap her normal attacks, she'll deal anemo damage to opponents in front, and this will be considered normal attack damage. But if you hold it, she'll enter her aiming mode and start loading bullets in the chamber, and after it's done, she'll fire 6 bullets at once. Also, you don't have to load all 6 bullets in if you don't want to, it just depends on how long you charge it for. You can either charge 2 bullets, 3 bullets, 4 bullets, and so on. You get the idea. And as for the aiming mode, you can probably choose multiple enemies with this, or target a single enemy if you want to. Now that you know the basics, let's understand it further. So there's more to her hold variant. Firstly, the shells that you'll fire after holding are called Shadow Hunt shells. These are different from the ones she fires after tapping, as they deal almost double the damage. Along with this, if you charge all 6 bullets, the 4th, 5th, and 6th shells loaded into the cylinder will undergo elemental conversion based on the elemental types of the characters in the party. So for each Pyro, Hydro, Cryo, or Electro character in the party, 1 Shadow Hunt shell will be converted into something called the Shining Shadow Hunt shell of the corresponding elemental type, and it'll deal elemental damage corresponding to that elemental type. Also, the damage done by this shell is almost triple that of a normal Shadow Hunt shell, and this damage will be considered as charged attack damage. If you didn't get it, then simply put, imagine you have Chasca, Xiangling, Layla, and Keqing in a team. Now, after using her skill, holding it and loading all bullets, when you fire it, the 4th, 5th, and 6th shells will be converted to their element type. So the 4th shell will deal Pyro damage, the 5th shell will deal Cryo damage, and the 6th shell will deal Electro damage. Pretty neat. Also, before we move on, something about the firing order. The gun fires in a LFO order, which basically means the gun fires the first shell last and the last shell first. Imagine you loaded all 6 bullets in it. It'll fire the 6th bullet first, then the 5th, then the 4th, then the 3rd, 2nd, and finally the first one. You get it now. Also here are all the multipliers and other details. In her burst, she fires a single shell called the Gale-Splitting Soul Seeker shell.
That's quite big.
This shell deals AoE anemo damage, and after a bit, the shell splits into 6 Soul Seeker shells, which attack nearby enemies. Now these Soul Seeker shells use the same mechanic as her skill. So if there are any Pyro, Hydro, Cryo, or Electro characters in the party, 2 Soul Seeker shells will undergo elemental conversion and become Radiant Soul Seeker shells, which deal elemental damage of the corresponding elemental type. Now, for example, if you have 1 Pyro, 1 Hydro, and 1 Cryo character in your party, then you'll have 2 Pyro bullets, 2 Cryo bullets, and 2 Hydro bullets. If you have something like 1 Pyro and 2 Hydro characters, then you'd have 2 Pyro bullets and 4 Hydro bullets, and if it's 1 Hydro and 1 Pyro, then it'll be 2 Hydro bullets, 2 Pyro bullets, and 2 Anemo bullets. You get the idea. Here's the multiplier and everything else you need to know. Finally, moving to her passives. In her first passive, after you use her skill and your party has 1, 2, or 3 Pyro, Hydro, Cryo, or Electro characters, then there's a 33%, 67%, and 100% chance respectively to trigger something called the Spirit Binding conversion. It'll cause the third bullet, or as it's called, Shadow Hunt Shell, to be converted into Shining Shadow Hunt Shell of the corresponding element. Now there's some more thing to clear up here. First, the chances of the bullet turning into a Shining Shadow Hunt Shell only go up when you have characters belonging to different elements. So if you have 3 Pyro characters, the chances of the bullet to convert will still be 33%. But if you have 1 Pyro, 1 Hydro, and 1 Cryo, the chances are now 100%. Second, while the third bullet is converting, the elements have a 50-50 chance of taking over. So if you have 1 Pyro and 2 Hydro, the bullet has a 50-50 chance of either being Pyro or Hydro. And if you have 3 different characters, suppose 1 Pyro, 1 Cryo, and 1 Hydro, then the bullet will have a 33% chance of either being Pyro, Cryo, or Hydro. It's 33% because then it'll be equal. So 33 plus 33 plus 33 is equal to 100. Now that you know how that works, there's one last thing. So for each party member who is of a different element, Chasca will also gain a stack of Spirit of Radiant Shadow, and she can have a maximum of 3 stacks of this. And what this does is, it'll increase the damage of the Shining Shadow Hunt Shells by 15, 35, and 65% respectively. In her second passive, when a party member triggers Night Soul Burst, Chasca will fire something called a Burning Shadow Hunt Shot at a nearby opponent, dealing a Nemo damage which will be equal to 1.5 times the damage normally done by Shadow Hunt Shells. Now once again, if your party has Pyro, Hydro, Cryo, or Electro characters, the Burning Shadow Hunt Shot will undergo elemental conversion and deal elemental damage corresponding to the elemental type, and the damage will be equal to 1.5 times the damage normally dealt by Shining Shadow Hunt Shells. In her third passive, there's nothing special. It just talks about phlogiston mechanics, but near the end there was something, and it said that, while you're airborne with her skill, if you held her skill again, she will perform a Night Soul-aligned plunging attack, and when released, the plunging attack will be cancelled, and she will remain airborne, but if she hits the ground, her skill will end and enter a cooldown. And finally, in her fourth passive, she'll restore 25 phlogiston points when your own party members defeat an opponent. However, this can be only triggered once every 12 seconds, and has no effect in domains or the Spiral Abyss. Going to her Constellations, Chasca's C1 is just focused around buffing her passive, so it buffs her first passive. Without her C1, the first passive only allowed her third Shadow Hunt Shell to be converted into a Shining Shadow Hunt Shell. But now with C1, both her third as well as the second shell will be converted into Shining Shadow Hunt Shells. And additionally, the chances of triggering Spirit Binding conversion are also increased. If you forgot, Spirit Binding conversion is just the process of the Shadow Hunt Shell being converted into a Shining Shadow Hunt Shell. So now if your party has 1, 2, or 3 types of Pyro, Hydro, Cryo, and Electro characters, then there is a 67, 100, and 100% chance of the Shadow Hunt Shells to convert into Shining Shadow Hunt Shells, compared to earlier. Additionally, along with all of these, Chasca's Night Soul and Phlogiston consumption is also decreased by 30% while being out of combat. In her C2, when Chasca comes on the field, she will obtain 1 stack of Spirit of the Radiant Shadow from her first passive talent, and additionally, after her Shining Shadow Hunt Shells hit an opponent, they will deal AoE elemental damage of the element they are infused with, and the damage will be equal to 400% of Chasca's attack. Now this does sound really good, but there are some limitations, which are that it can only trigger once, meaning only after she loads all 6 bullets, because it only applies to the 6th bullet, not the 3rd, 4th, and 5th. So to use her C2, you'd have to load all 6 bullets. Her C3 will increase the level of her skill by 3. Now, before understanding her C4, let's recall something real quick so it's easier. So after you use her burst, she fires a Gale-splitting Soul Seeker shell, then after it hits the opponent or in a bit, it splits into 6 Soul Seeker shells. And if you have Pyro, Hydro, Cryo, or Electro characters, the Soul Seekers will undergo elemental change and convert into Radiant Soul Seeker shells. So in her C4, when these Radiant Soul Seeker shells from her burst hit opponents, they will restore 1.5 elemental energy to Chasca. Additionally, it will also deal AoE elemental damage of the element it's been infused with, and the damage it deals will be equal to 400% of Chasca's attack. Now, similarly to her C2, it can only trigger once every time she uses her burst, and what I mean by that is that only one of the 6 Radiant Soul Seeker shells will be infused with this buff, so only the first Radiant Soul Seeker shell will carry this buff. Her C5 increases the level of her burst by 3. Finally, her C6 improves her DPS output. So after the Spirit Binding conversion from the first passive is triggered, Chasca will enter a state called Fatal Rounds, and for the next 3 seconds, when Chasca holds and loads her shots, it'll finish loading instantly, and the crit damage of that instance of multi-target fire increases by 120%. Now this term called multi-target fire might be pretty new to you, but it's really nothing. It's just the group name for her tap and hold variation. Talking about her best cons and cons worth investing in, I'd say both her C1 and C2 are pretty good, C1 probably being the better one, as it somewhat allows you to use characters other than Pyro, Hydro, Cryo, and Electro. And for the rest of the constellations, they are pretty good, but nothing that makes you go,
"Oh my God."
But still worth investing in nonetheless if you like her. And if you can't really go for her constellations due to having a lack of primos like me, fret not, as nothing crucial to her kit is locked behind her constellations. They just improve her overall damage. Now looking at her artifacts, her best in slot artifact set is the new set that recently released with Natlon, called Obsidian Codex. As for the main stats you'd want to go with, attack percentage or energy recharge on Sands, attack percentage on Goblet, and either crit rate or crit damage on Circlet. As for the substats, you'd want to have energy recharge. Just aim for something like 170 to 200% ER, and other than this, it's just the usual, crit rate or damage and attack or attack percentage. Now finally looking at her weapons. Her best in slot weapon will obviously be her signature weapon, so let's look at her signature weapon. So it has a long name, which is Astral Vulture's Crimson Plumage. Anyhow, other than that, it gives a decent crit damage of 66.2% at level 90 and a base attack of 608. And as for the passives, so after triggering a swirl reaction, your attack increases by 24% for 12 seconds. And when the party contains 1, 2, or more characters of a different elemental type from the equipping character, the equipping character's charged attack damage is increased by 20%, 48%, and elemental burst damage increases by 10%, 24%, respectively, which is pretty damn good. If you're rich, please send. If you're going to refine this weapon, here are the refinement stats as well. As for her alternative weapons, try to get bows, which give either crit rate, damage, or attack, and can provide damage buffs to the elements Chasca uses. So some good suggestions would be the first Great Magic, Hunter's Path, Thundering Pulse, Polar Star, Skyward Harp, or Ammo's Bow. Also, as for the Ammo's Bow, I wouldn't really recommend it, as only 50% of the passive is actually usable since Chasca doesn't use arrows in her kit, unless someone somehow manages to make her physical. But still, by no means is the Ammo's Bow bad, it's just not really favorable for her. If you don't really have any other weapons laying around for her, then feel free to use the Ammo's Bow. As for the 4-star weapon, the Natlon craftable bow should suffice. If not that, then you could go for Hamayumi, the Viridescent Hunt, Black Cliff Warbow, Scion of the Blazing Sun, or the upcoming gacha 4-star weapon called the Flower Wreathed Feathers. It's pretty good. It'll decrease your stamina consumption while gliding, give a 41% attack substat at level 90, and increase charged attack damage in its passive. As for her team comps, as you have already figured out, she only prefers teammates who are either Electro, Cryo, Pyro, or Hydro, unless you have her C1, which can enable you to use characters of other elements. While we can still wait and see if devs decide to change things, for now Chasca's best pairing will likely be with me, because I provide huge damage buffs for all elements. It is also worth noting that Chasca does not pair well with Faruzan due to the elemental restrictions and the fact that she deals very little anemo damage in a proper team. Now what do I think about her? Chasca comes with a rather fresh playstyle, with her skill transforming standard combat mechanics into something truly unique. The ability to ride her gun, combined with elemental infused shells, allows for versatile gameplay. And her reliance on multi-element team compositions adds some depth to her kit. On the merit side, Chasca's elemental adaptability and potential for high elemental damage make her a solid addition to teams focused on elemental reactions. Her signature weapon enhances her potential even further. However, her limitations come from the complexity of her kit and the heavy reliance on team composition, specifically needing Pyro, Hydro, Cryo, or Electro characters to maximize her damage output. In short, Chasca is a great pick if you have a well-rounded collection of elemental units to support her and ignore the issue of her limited team synergy. But if you're looking for an easier-to-use DPS or find the elemental restrictions too limiting, you might want to save those primos for another banner.